Thank you. And welcome, you hardy souls here who made it out on this miserable, rainy, supposedly spring evening. And welcome also to everyone listening on KBOO. On behalf of the History of Social Justice Organizing, Occupy History, and our co-sponsor for this evening, the Center for Women, Politics, and Policy, welcome to part 3 of the Portland Women's Movement, Fighting for Ideas and Dollars. We're going to have 4 panelists tonight, but before I introduce them, I just want to say a few little housekeeping things. First of all, this is the last one for us before the summer, and we'll be back in the fall. You can find out about our next program by either signing up. We have a sheet like this out on the table in the hall, and you can sign up to get emails about our next programs. Also on that table is information about KBOO. Also, there are evaluation forms for this evening's presentation. There is a, because we are here about social justice, there is a petition out there from 350 PBX. It's a petition to the Portland City Council to ask them to divest from any of their fossil fuel investments. You can sign the petition out there. You at home can go to 350pbx.org to sign it. And I think that's all. So our format tonight, we have 4 speakers on 2 subjects. The first 2 are going to be speaking about women's studies here at Portland State, the founding, early years of the founding of it. And the second 2 are going to be talking about a lawsuit that women in the Oregon higher education system brought against the state for equity. The first 2 speakers, we're going to have women's studies first. The first speaker is going to be Nona Glazer. She is a Professor Emerita in Sociology here at PSU. She co-founded the Women's Studies program with 2 other professors, Nancy Porter and Nancy Hoffman, and many PSU students. Many of her publications address women's unwaged labor and its use by capitalist firms to reduce their wage costs in healthcare delivery and retailing. Other work is on curriculum and integration, with her naive expectation that gender, class, and ethnicity would quickly become part of all university curricula rather than being lodged mainly in special studies programs. She was also a plaintiff in Penk et al. Versus the Oregon State Board of Higher Education, which is coming up next. Julie Allen, and I'm introducing them in the order they are sitting, farthest left first. Second is Julie M. Allen. She was a graduate student at PSU when women's studies was getting developed, and she was a big participant in that in the early to mid 70s. After she left PSU, she taught women's studies. Well, here she taught Introduction to Women's Studies and developed a course in feminist critical theory as well. She went on to study rhetoric at the University of Texas at Austin, and she was a member of the faculty at Sonoma State University, where she developed more courses focused on rhetoric and social movements. She's recently completed a biography of Anne Rochester and Grace Hutchins, whose partnership and devotion to each other fueled their activism for labor and women's rights. And I'm pleased to have a copy of the book here this evening. It's just out in hardcover. She warns us that it's very expensive, but that a more affordable paperback edition is coming out next year. Our third speaker is JoAnn Reynolds. She was associate counsel with Don Willner in representing the class of women faculty members in the Penk case, which was tried from September 1984 to June 1985. She now specializes in family law, representing clients in divorce, parenting, support, property division, and other family matters. She is of counsel to Yates, Matthew, and Eaton, PC in Portland. Before that, she was an associate and then a partner with Willner Bennett firm from 1980 through 2002. Marjorie Burns, sitting closest to me here, was a witness for Penk versus Oregon State Board of Higher Education in the 80s. Though she's published on women's studies and testified about women's issues in both California and Oregon, her main area of expertise is 19th century British literature. She's been on the faculty of Portland State for 37 years. She's now Professor Emerita. She's also taught at Berkeley, where she got her doctorate, Lewis and Clark, Stanford, University of Oslo, and the University of Trondheim, which is also in Norway, where she was a Fulbright scholar. She has many, many publications. Her most recent to be republished by Hooligan Press here at PSU is The Great Missoula Floods. She lives in Trout Lake, which is at the base of Mount Adams. And she was, as a witness in Penk versus the Oregon State Board of Education, she fell in love with, and he fell in love with her, Don Willner, the chief attorney, who unfortunately has passed on. But here is his picture, and tonight is his birthday. And that's how we picked the date for this event. And Marjorie will say a little more about that when it comes her turn. So they're each going to speak for about 10 minutes, and partly because we're broadcasting it, we will not be taking any Q&A or discussion until all four of them have spoken, because we're going to need you to speak on the mic if you have a question. So we will start now with Nona.
Hello. I'm going to talk about women's studies from the standpoint of organizing, because that's, I think, the theme of this. And I'm going to make one point very quickly, and that is that women's studies, organizing for women's studies occurred in a particular historical context, which I think is important, because when we try to organize things we're doing in a particular historical moment. And the moment was just incredible kinds of activities and actions throughout the United States from all different kinds of groups. And in addition to that, in the anti-war group, the students were organizing and protesting. Civil rights, the universities were great places of ferment. And then as well as that, there were important books that were published, Ben Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, that certainly, one of my friends says nobody was reading, but some of us were. And then I had my own personal experience, which was someone who came from somewhere between the old left and the new left, if that is a category, and who thought that organizing for women, because now by then was an organization, was just unimportant. The important thing was to organize civil rights. And I had an experience in the summer of 1969 in which I was totally bored at the ASA, American Sociological Society meeting. And we went across to Glyde Memorial Church. I walked into this room of women who were beginning to organize the caucus in sociology. And what I listened to for 45 minutes was 4 panelists, like today, and very different women, very different kinds of women. And throughout the room would come these laughters of recognition. And for the first time in my life, I realized that it wasn't that I was some kind of an idiot or ill-mannered or stupid or didn't know how to get along at the university, but that I was being subject to things that were really systemic to the university and systemic to our society. So I came back from that meeting in August primed. And then in the winter of 1969, Portland State students who have to be unnamed because I don't know who they were anymore, it was 45 years ago, so approached me and asked if I would teach a course on women. And I said, sure, why not? It was too late for me for it to actually be officially in the catalog, because the catalog, this previous spring, so I was allowed to teach it as an overload. And I'm being ironic. And I taught it as an overload several times, and then because of the nature of the university, the flexibility of Portland State, it was then I began to teach it on a regular basis. I often taught 2 sections a term, And I taught it until I decided I didn't want to teach it anymore, or maybe we finally had other women in the department, because I was the only woman for years. And that woman, one of those women, wanted to teach it. The interesting thing to me when I think about this for this presentation is, what did we want and what did we get? And I think what we wanted, it was Nancy Porter, Nancy Hoffman, myself, meeting, I think with the help of other women in the English department on the faculty, which there were more women there than any place else in the university, and students from throughout the university. What did we want? I don't know that we knew anything in great detail about what we wanted, except we wanted courses about women in the university. That was the main thing that we wanted, because we thought that the viewpoint of women, the experience of women, topics specific to women, childcare, housework, domestic labor, all those kinds of things, were never touched upon in the curriculum unless accidentally, maybe in a footnote. So, and the second thing was that the only way we thought about doing that was to have a special studies program. And so we wanted a special studies program. And what this meant, the consequences of that, was that we wanted other things. We wanted more women faculty, and we wanted a place for feminist research. Because if you're at a university, the pressure is that you have to do research. And so that we ended up, at least with those kinds of things, a special studies program and so on and so forth, and feminist scholarship, more women. And there was a very positive outcome that I think was really very clear. That one of the things that we got from this was that women students had a place to go. The place to go was both courses in the department that were women and you could fill in wherever that and that follows the and. And it also was a women's studies program that was located in the College of Humanities, I think is what it was then. Bill Hamilton, for reasons I have no idea about, agreed to fund what we really decided was an ad hoc program, because we knew that the state board would not approve it because it would be a, quote, duplication. And it was against the rules to duplicate. So we said we were going to have an ad hoc program. We called it ad hoc, literally, Program in Women's Studies. And we just kind of went with it, teaching courses, gathering faculty from around the university. And it created a place for women faculty, and it created a place for women students. I think it really became kind of a place in which women could work with some of the problems, women students could work with some of the problems that they encountered. And in the long run, what happened was that we got courses throughout the university. If you look at the Portland State Catalog, or many of the major universities, certainly public institutions throughout the United States, there are women's studies programs, women's studies courses. I think we were maybe the third program, even though we're the second or third, I guess, San Diego State, University of Oregon, and then Portland State, even though we were ad hoc for, I don't know, a long time. That was, I think, really important, because it then forced the departments over the long run to think about, maybe we need more women. The departments are interested in getting students. So if we're going to teach a course on how to open wine with corkscrews, I exaggerate, but I think that some department would say, oh, that's a great idea. So I think that in some ways, the very flexibility, the openness, and the goals of the university helped us at Portland State. It didn't help us in all kinds of ways, but at least it helped us to get those courses in. I think the other thing that I want to say about women's studies was that it really gave a home for people like myself, and I think other people who were really multidisciplinary in their view of the world. It wasn't that you couldn't do that in sociology, but it was more that in women's studies it became so clear and so apparent that you had to work across the disciplines, that those disciplines had to include biology as well as history and economics and so on and so forth. And it was kind of fun to do that. I liked doing it a lot. The more negative side of what I think of about as women's studies is that I think in some ways what's happened is that women's studies and feminist scholarship has become a kind of institutional way of continuing to marginalize women. I think that in some ways, in some ways it's not, in some ways it is. that when I look through the journal that I look through in sociology, I really kind of freak, because I see that what people are doing, for example, is saying that, well, we need a way of talking about women and class and ethnicity at the same time. And I'm thinking, wait a second, we need a way of talking about human beings in the society of class and race and ethnicity at the same time. And so this is what I mean by the kind of marginalization that can occur. And it's a problem. It really is a problem. I worked a little bit on something that was called Ramley curriculum integration. I was back east at a small women's college that for a term, and that's what the agenda was. So I spent time kind of studying that, working with other women on this issue. Came back here, and I was invited to different places to talk about it, and I could feel it was always men. I was invited to men's groups, classes of men, faculty, and the hostility was so thick. It was so problematic. They didn't want to be there. This was like, when human resources brings you in and forces you to listen about how to get along with everybody else. And, it wasn't working. So I think one of the things that I began to think about was, how is this going to end? And I thought, well, it's going to end, or it's going to get better when the old people die off. I'm sorry to say that, one of them. But in some ways, I think that the university, my department, sociology, became much more flexible, much more open to women and to feminist scholarship after I retired, when they hired some more lefties like me, and they had, one was a man, one was a woman, and the woman went on to become chair of the department. And I understand now that sociology, I hope I'm not wrong about this, is over half women. Well, that's, I was the only woman for years in the department. So, that's really changed, and that certainly, is to the good. And I can't speak anything more about, what else has happened in other departments and so on and so forth. So there's been a push that's positive, but then there's been this kind of continuing ghetto and intellectual kind of work that has to be necessary, because there's not much space yet for it in the rest of the disciplines of the university. I don't want to overstate this, because I do believe that in anthropology and sociology, there are efforts made to change that. I know that men and women are writing together, and men are trying to write things on these kinds of issues. So it's not, I don't want to, engage in hyperbole, but I do always consider this an issue. It's always for me a worry, and I really worried when women's studies became a department at Portland State, because I thought, what? The idea is that there should be, women's studies should be everywhere, not just one place.
All right, I'm Julie Allen, and I'm going to give you the perspective of someone who was a graduate student at Portland State during the early 1970s and who was taking part in this effort to create a program. I want to give you three key words that I think articulate what we were doing. First of all, we were challenging what was considered to be the received notions about what was college material and what wasn't. Beyond that, we were collaborating. And we were collaborating across disciplines, as Nona has said. We were collaborating across communities, and we were collaborating across hierarchies, in the sense that students and faculty were working together easily on these projects. And then finally, we were crafty. And by that I do not mean arts and crafts. I mean that we used the available resources in unorthodox ways to get what we wanted. Nona has spoken a little bit about the context, and I couldn't agree more that what took place because it was in a particular time and place. There were these huge struggles going on around the Vietnam War, around race and class injustices, and this was an international movement, in fact. We were reading things like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We were reading The Schoolboys of Barbiana, who wrote Letter to a Teacher. These were books that were questioning the direction of education. And they were asking that education begin with the experiences of the students. Paulo Freire came up with the phrase, the banking style of education, which was what was taking place at the time, that students were simply empty vessels to be filled. So as students, we wanted the colleges to speak to us, and we wanted to begin with our own experiences. And we also wanted the colleges to participate in changing society, not continue to reproduce it as it was. So this atmosphere coincided with women being thoroughly fed up with post-war fear-mongering and conformity and the suppression of women in society. And by 1967, radical feminist energy had erupted again, and there were organizations being founded such as the New York Radical Women, Red Stockings, the Women's Liberation Front. There were consciousness-raising groups all over the country, and there were mimeographed articles. And one of the things that I think is important about this particular moment is that this is when inexpensive printing began to be available. And so people were able to print off their ideas, and they did. There were multiple newsprint publications, there were magazines, there were things. Xeroxing was still a little expensive, but we were masters at the ditto machines. And so you got things like that were not necessarily being vetted in scholarly journals, such things like The Politics of Housework. And these were informally being studied in the community, and the community was coming up with things like a Woman's Place bookstore, the Women's Liberation School, the Feminist Women's Health Clinic, car repair, radio broadcasting, lighting and sound for performances. Women were teaching each other how to do things, and we wanted the same thing to start happening within the universities. So Portland State was ideal because it had a history of serving the community. It was established to serve the returning veterans from World War II. And that's not to say, though, that, as Nona has pointed out, there was plenty of resistance. But at the same time, there was still an atmosphere that we could move into and begin to build something. As students, few of us were coming straight from high school. Most of us had been out in the world working, and a lot of us had been or were still working as secretaries, because that was the kind of work that women were able to get at the time. So we brought a lot of knowledge and skills to this incipient women's studies program. The program in the early years offered courses, but the courses were not well funded. They were dependent on people like Nona offering things as overloads, or occasionally a department would let somebody offer something that was related to women, such as Nancy Porter's course on Doris Lessing. But there was no organization, so as students we created one, and we did it by using the student fee-based resources. So we organized the Women's Union, and within the Women's Union we were able to get an office for women's studies. So student fees funded women's studies, and beyond that we began to find other ways. There was a program called Chiron, and Chiron was also student fee-based. And within that program, a student who had particular expertise in an area was allowed to teach a course on that if she or he could get a faculty member as a sponsor. So that's how I was able to teach a course in feminist critical theory. So we had students teaching Chiron courses. We used student fees to pay a nominal amount to students who then taught Introduction to Women's Studies. And then we also paid ourselves to organize and go around and interview faculty members and try to persuade them to offer courses. And that's how we got some absolutely marvelous courses like Biochemistry of Women. And we also used, various other sources. Summer school, we discovered, had very little oversight in the sense that anybody could offer a course if they were approved by the director of summer school. So that's how we were able to get a wonderful scholar named Jane Bowers, who taught women and music, and went on to establish herself as a major scholar in that field. All right, so at the same time there was a proposal. We worked on the proposal. A woman named Margaret Bird came as a student, came in and rewrote and typed up the proposal, which was no small matter in those days. And we shepherded it through all the committees and up to the state board. The program was funded and then defunded about 4 or 5 years later. And I just want to say my own personal hero from that moment, this was the early 80s, Laurel Kirsch, who has since passed away, was the secretary in the University Scholars Program. After the program was defunded, packed up in boxes, put into a warehouse, Laurel stayed after work. She had access to the vault where the records were kept. She stayed after work for weeks, compiled statistics demonstrating that women's studies was worth funding. And that was she was able to make an argument based on statistics. That's what allowed the program to regain its funding. And just in conclusion, I will say that we were often criticized for being reformist, working within a male institution, but at the same time, we did accomplish a lot, and the last thing I would say is that we wouldn't have gotten anywhere if we'd always played by the rules.
Hello, I'm JoAnn Reynolds, and I'm the associate lawyer that was on the Penk case. I happen to have the distinction tonight of being the only panel member and probably the only person in the room who's wearing open-toed shoes on a day like this. So, didn't think about it this morning, but here I am. The lawsuit I was introduced to it on my very first day as a brand new associate at the office. I was whisked away to a press conference on my first day at the firm Willner, Bennett, Bobbin and Hartman was the name of the firm. And it was a discrimination case against all of the 8 institutions, against the Board of Higher Education and all the 8 institutions in pay, promotion, and tenure. There had been a forerunner suit, which was called Wilma Hine against the Oregon College of Education. And that was 8 women, and they sued the school, and Don Willner was also their attorney. And they sued under the Equal Pay Act. Under the Equal Pay Act, you only talk about salary. If you have comparators that are similar in job skills and duties, and you don't make the same, you've made your case. You don't have to show there's an intent. You just show the disparity in pay. So they won that case. It did go up on appeal and came back and had some things, but eventually they won that case. So then we thought, well, if they have that at Oregon College of Education, how am I? Not close enough? Is that all right? Is that better? Okay. So we decided let's take on the whole Board of Higher Ed, because with a larger group of women, statistics will show there are large disparities. And when statistics are used to show the large disparities, they won't be able to explain them away. Well, so there were 8 institutions. It was University of Oregon, Oregon State, Portland State, the medical school, OHSU, and then the 4 smaller schools, OCE, which is now Western Oregon, Southern Oregon, OIT, Oregon Institute of Technology, and Eastern Oregon. So all 8 schools. And the class action was discrimination against women in pay, promotion, and tenure. This, of course, required us to show intent. The case took 9 months to try. We were in trial for 9 months, which coincidentally is just about the time it takes to make a baby. We thought that was prophetic. The court found there was no dispute that there was disparity. In other words, everybody agreed that there was a disparity, a statistically significant disparity. But what happens in a case is first the plaintiffs, that's the women, we put on our case and prove the disparity. Then the defense comes in and they say, but here there are other non-discriminatory reasons for that. And then we get to rebut theirs by showing their reasons are pretext. So we said there was a disparity, and the defense came in and said there were legitimate non-discriminatory reasons. I have to say our strongest case was pay. There's no question about that. In promotion and tenure, even looking at the cases, we were a class action, so all of the women in the entire state system were included in the class. And even as plaintiffs looking at it, you think there are some individual determinations on those factors. Now, we still have statistically significant differences, so we felt good moving forward on that. But it was especially hard to show discrimination in promotion and tenure. And the state would come in with factors such as the quality of teaching. A lot of them were subjective factors, you see. Quality of teaching, community service, service to the institution, research quality. Now that was how do you measure that? Sometimes they would say, well, her articles aren't cited often enough, or her articles aren't cited in the right journals, or that, you know, and then scholarship. All these things are subjective, and they are legitimate factors. So basically, our approach was we use statistics, and we're going to show that there's such a broad discrepancy over the whole population that they can't come up with enough reasons for it. And their defense was, but in this case, there was a difference. In this case, there was a difference. In this case, there was a difference. So they did the individual, and we did the broad. We were talking against each other to some extent. Oh yeah, we just tried to be all-encompassing. And the more encompassing, the harder it was for the defense to rebut it. So one huge consequence of doing this was me sitting at the counsel table with my client next to me. Marjorie was one of them, not one of the plaintiffs. And listening to this person who's extremely respected in a collegial department and has a lot of respect from her peers. So she gets up to testify, and that's nerve-wracking enough. Then she comes and sits down next to me, and her department chair comes in, who's been her friend and colleague, and starts saying things like, well, she had a smaller caseload, or she had a larger caseload, but she didn't have the right publications, or she did not enough service, or too much service. There was only, we began to call it the yeah, but defense. Whatever we said, they said, yeah, but. So that's what it was. So, however the court decided that the individual defenses were sufficient, that we were unable to prove by statistics only and by our anecdotal evidence. We had a lot of anecdotal evidence that we were unable to prove intent. We approved the disparity, but were unable to prove intent. So I was asking some of the witnesses who testified in preparation for this. I called a few people, and they said that they really felt that it had done some damage to their departments. They feel that they had recovered afterwards, largely because of time and because of new people coming in, but that it really had done some damage. And one of our witnesses had continued to do salary analyses because that was part of her job in the sociology department. And she said that she felt the cohort of women at that university were still being discriminated against. So basically, I just wanted to read you the court's final analysis. It said, this is the Court of Appeals. It said, while the plaintiffs find fault with the way the trial court interpreted the statistical evidence, and then the Court of Appeals said, with 20/20 hindsight, we might view some of the statistical evidence differently. So they were throwing this little bone saying, well, maybe you were right, ladies, but we're not going to find that the court made error. So that was the end of it. And again, we cited that the plaintiffs had proved that there were disparities in the salaries and other terms of employment, but did not prove they were the product of disparate treatment. So it was an amazing experience, and Marjorie's going to talk a little more about the effects on personal.
I have a little prop here because it's Don's birthday. I have what went on his birthday cake. The reason this is important, it's a real cheesy, cheapo little plastic tennis player who played tennis. But you can make it left-handed or right-handed, and he was a left-handed tennis player. And everything is all the prejudice against the left, so we'll put that out there. He was really pleased that it could be made left-handed. I came into the case in midstream. Other people had been working at it for a while, and I became aware of the case, and I became one of those that went down and helped at the office and ended up being a witness. A witness meant I had to have two comparators from my department. That was pretty easy. There were two other people who overlapped me, males, in 19th century British literature. They both had been put on the tenure track. I had not. They had both had sabbaticals. I had not. And they had sabbaticals without ever publishing anything. They had neither of them published anything. I'd already published. But I had one of those department chairs who was uncomfortable with women making advancement. The term I used for him was that it seemed unseemly for women to be wanting to get more money. Nice enough fellow, other than that. I'll give you a little touch about my own personality. I would go down from Portland State on Broadway to the courthouse. This will tell you something about my nature. I passed a place that said Nails on Broadway. So, why not nuts and bolts and screws? Why just Nails on Broadway? It took me weeks to realize what Nails on Broadway meant. That tells you a lot about me. The rest of them laughed at me. At the very end of the case, the lawyer for the other side stood up as his closing statement said something to the effect, I'm not going to have this just right, but I'm going to give you the sense of it. If the women in the Oregon State system of higher education have received less pay and other amenities than the men, it's because they have deserved less. Well, the case ended right then. I don't remember which other woman, we just jumped out of a nail him. He was rather embarrassed. I don't think he believed that we were inferior. I don't believe he believed that, but he made his case and trying to win the case as he did. I was asked as a witness, and I didn't answer it as well as I could have on the spot, why, if it wasn't true that I had published more because I was not always teaching full-time. Of course, I had 4 children, and one of them was a toddler, but that's when I realized that my 2 comparators had had a whole year off with pay and hadn't produced a thing. But I didn't come up with that on the stand. It came to me afterwards, so I was feeling pretty unhappy about myself in that position. It's hard up there, though, isn't it? They say, isn't it true? Isn't it possible that because? And finally, well, yes. The case ended, and we're trying for appeal, but before all of that had started, I left for Fulbright teaching in Norway. It's the second time I taught in Norway. And I got a phone call one day from Don, very upset that they had lost. He used to say to people, and he even said it to Helen Fry, the judge, I may have lost the case, but I won my wife. I wanted to share a letter I got from you, from a woman named Ann Hofstetter, and I talked to her today, and I talked to Anna Penk. I have a flyer here, really it's from the web. A fascinating woman from Greece. She worked as a child running messages during the war, working as a child spy. A brilliant woman, absolutely brilliant. I'll read you a touch of what it says here in this one blurb. It said, described as brilliant by her professors, her doctoral dissertation in mathematical logic earned her worldwide acclaim, yet despite her excellent education, outstanding teaching reviews, and international reputation in mathematics, Professor Penk continually found herself being treated as a less valuable faculty member than her male counterparts. She received far less pay than the male colleagues, taught many more courses, repeatedly was denied tenure-track positions, forced to share an office with other females while men had their own offices. I was in the same office with another woman for years. And we are now back as Emerita. Both of us are in the same office again, the same windowless office. We come full circle. I feel like I'm supposed to die now because Deanne and I are back in that same office. But and others got their own office. Just to share a bit of Anne's poignant letter, she said to me while I was in Norway, I won't read much of it, that can be boring. Okay, dear Marjorie, you know the worst by now and are probably depressed since you do not have the advantage of a support system and the grand plan to win the war, although we lost the battle. I want to pause a minute. Here in this letter, in 1985, in February, Ann Hofstetter says, although we lost the war, we lost the battle, we're going to win the war. Today, she said to me on the phone, we lost the battle, but we won the war. And I was surprised at what JoAnn was saying because in my department, things became better very quickly. Don lost the case, but to my mind, things became better for women, quite a bit better, immediately. And I was tenure track and moved right up from there. At any rate, Anne says she picked up Don at his office, and she and another woman went to the courthouse. And one woman went in and picked up the decision. Don sat in the car reading it. He was stunned. So were we, she writes. Obviously, we lost on the statistical witnesses of the state, 600,000 for Siskin.
He was the state's East Coast statistician, right?
That's what they spent for him alone. And we had Mary Gray, who was both a lawyer and a mathematics professor. Where in?
Professor Ramsey, wasn't
And
it?
Ramsey too, but Mary Gray would come and help us.
Oh, Mary Gray.
Mary Gray,
Mhm.
wonderful woman. But these people were having to almost volunteer at times. Any rate, 6,000 for Siska. And then Ann goes on to say, I remember back to the day Don was so upset because the judge would not allow our expert to rebut. So we were even stopped from doing that. Don turned to me and said, we just lost the case. I didn't believe it possible at the time, but evidently he was right. So she talks about Don suffering, and they went to Anna Penk's house in Salem and waited for her. And finally everybody gathered there. They dropped Don at Mount Angel, where he was just too depressed, and he went to be with the monks. He's Jewish, but he went to be with the monks. All right. She said they had a wake of sorts. They sat around having a wake. And then a woman, Margaret Lumpkin, who had been so powerful and capable, wonderful woman, had been in London, and she said, Anne says in her letter, Margaret had a sense she needed to come back, and came back on a plane and was there, and she immediately got everybody fired up again. What a shot of adrenaline she is, Anne writes. I immediately felt 100% better and called Don's friend. So this woman started us saying, we're going to go on appeal, we're going to fight again. And then what happened, Anne talks about women going to the legislature and talking to legislators who were very, very sympathetic. Repeatedly, she found ones that said the State Board of Higher Education had not done well by us. And she talks about Margie Heinrich saying in front of the legislature, if you're guilty, you always have the most expensive lawyer. Not sure that's true, but is at any rate. If the state is so pristine, why did they have to spend $4.5 million? At any rate, Suzanne, it's very heartening. Now you have to measure this in mid-1980 prices too, which makes a difference. Several bills were put into the hopper, she said, bills trying to solve the problem other ways since the suit hadn't done it. So people were still going on. They had looking for other attorneys for the appeal, but the problem was getting money. The women were giving the money, and it was tough going. Don was greatly in debt. He borrowed in all sorts of money. And that's the way it was for some while after that. He was in debt. Margaret was going on talking to the legislature, but Anne says, at any rate, it feels good to be fighting. Then she says, as you know, only 3 plaintiffs won. All of those were from that first case that the same judge had ruled in favor for. It makes the statement that perhaps she didn't want to change her mind on everything. So even mentions that newspapers came out saying that the state had done poorly. The Oregonian, she says, even the Oregonian thought that the man, what's his name, was
Lisa.
Lennon, who was on the state board, he got up and made one of those snide comments too. He crowed, says Anne, about how little money it would cost after the trial, as well as saying that women didn't know how to negotiate and that's why they lost. So Anne says it's been our problem all along. But the legislators tore into him for that, which was kind of nice. That's all I can share with you from that, but it was extremely emotional time. I had to type up Anne's letter because she wrote it in longhand, and I couldn't have read any of it to you right today. Yeah, right, exactly. To me, it was one of the emotional times of my life, the most emotional. I wasn't there at the time the decision came. I was getting it from this very dear, very kindly letter from Ann Hofstetter and from Don's phone call. I couldn't believe that we would lose. It just seemed so obvious that we were right. And I looked at my comparators. I looked what happened to Anna Penk. How little credit she was given as a woman mathematician. And yet we did. Yet we lost. But in my case, and in Anna's too, good things came from it. It does say in Anna's letter that, the piece from the web, that she was given $485.17 in damages. It did make her a full professor.
Yeah, she got a promotion. I forgot to mention there were 3 out of the 22 plaintiffs, there were 3 that had their cases that prevailed, and they were all from Oregon College of Education. They weren't from the other lawsuit, but they were from the same school.
From the same school, and the
Yes.
same judge.
The same judge heard both cases, right?
So, before we open it to the audience, I just wanted to see if any of you on the panel wanted to react to anything others had to say, or...
I had one question I had remembered from what Don said, is that they said that maybe women didn't have good publications, but they did not have statistics on publications.
Right. They didn't have statistics on publications.
So they-
individual approach.
So to say that women didn't have good publications, possibly, you know, we suspect it's that. They didn't have proof of it, and it wasn't true.
Nona, you were a plaintiff also?
I wasn't a plaintiff, I was,
On the mic.
Yes.
I wasn't a plaintiff, I was a witness.
Oh, witness.
And I was a witness, I told JoAnn this, I was on the stand, I had been on sabbatical the previous year, and I was on the stand, and they had all these statistical charts on one of their props, and they were trying to prove that I was something, you know, less than I was supposedly was. And the wind came up and it blew them out the window and into the courtyard. And they went flying down to the courtyard and nobody had a key to the courtyard. And I thought that sums up the suit. They really have no data.
Do we have comments, questions out here?
What was the view?
Oops.
I'm just curious as to the men's mentality during that period and your male coworkers, and what do you think was the benefit of, I mean, were there any allies, or what was the benefit of them all being against you?
Are you talking about
Who are you
case or are you
talking
talking
about?
about women's studies?
What's that?
Are you asking about
During
the
the
law
case
case?
and your colleagues, during the male colleagues.
I think there were supportive male faculty as well, and Marjorie can speak to that more personally.
Very much so, although
Yeah.
my department chair had said when it was somebody tried to get a divorce, oh, don't do that, because you'll need your husband's money. Somebody was underpaid. So there were attitudes of that sort, but definitely, I mean, women didn't get the vote on their own in a way. They had to have men convinced. I'm always aware of that there have been men who've supported.
It's the same in women's studies, that the first thing that we put out in the ballroom, I remember that Dave Kressler, who was in the psychology department, helped organize that. And that was in January 1970. I think that's correct.
Could you say more about that event?
Well, I don't really remember an awful lot more about it, except that it must have been part of what the students were doing, going around trying to get women in all the departments to participate, but we also wanted to make sure that there was student support and that people knew what we were doing. Do you remember that any more than I do? I just remember that I was about to go on sabbatical. I just had surgery, and I was, I was so grateful that I had a lectern to kind of lean on. I have no idea what I talked about, and I think there were numbers of other people in that ballroom, but it was an attempt to try to inform the whole university that we really had an ad hoc program going. I think it was before Meg. When was Meg hired?
She didn't come till around
Get on the mic.
66 or, she didn't come till around 66,
No.
76. I'm sorry.
76. So from 69 when we kind of began all this, and then the proposal, which I remember working on in the summer of 1970 when I came back, that we had 6 years in which we were kind of seat of our pants, and I always thought that Nancy Porter, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, was really a mainstay of keeping the program organized and going, and, right? You might want to say something more about that.
Well, certainly Nancy was critical in keeping the program alive. But it was, as I said before, it was very much a collaborative effort. And everything requires money, and in our case, as I said, it was coming from student fees. And at some point, Chris Thompson from the English department got involved, and she was also very, very supportive and very active. And so...
When did the program move to social science? It moved from Bill Hamilton to George Hoffman.
It was sometime
Later.
during the 80s.
Oh, okay, a lot later.
Yeah.
I was actually a student, oh, go ahead.
I think it may have been after the program got defunded and then was refunded, when I was talking about that it moved into social science.
And George was actually one of the people I complained about when I was on the witness stand, because, and there was an article in the Oregonian, because I had submitted a grant application to him, just a courtesy. The grant application wasn't to the university, it was to who knows what. And he wrote back a little note that said, yes, I approve the grant, but I think women's proper place is really in the kitchen, in the home, in the bed. And
You at home cannot see the
dean
open
of the
mouth.
College of Social Science. And I
The
went,
drop jaws.
yeah, and I was very bad, and my husband said, oh, he's just kidding. And male reaction. And the chair of the department, who was a friend of mine, Chuck Bolton, said, oh, he's just kidding, that's just his humor. And I said, yeah, some humor. And they say women, what was that cover? You know, women have no sense, feminists have no sense of humor.
Yes.
Well, this is just part of the context discussion, because you mentioned Margie Hendricks. And as all this was going on, Patsy Mink was coming and running for president. And Margie then ran against Hatfield. And, you know, so that what was going on in the universities as in the women's movement, it wasn't just the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, there was a women's movement. And there were so many different things that were happening in all these arenas of power that, and these women, I mean, I loved listening to you all, you know, who fought the good fight and who sort of laid the foundation for the change that started to come fairly slowly in these different places. But, you know, I just wanted to add that to the context.
You know, I'd like to add something too, because I left it out. Because one of the things that I think I really wanted to make a point of was that I think what's happened, and those of you who are like Julie, who are more closer to academia, or maybe people in the room who are still teaching, my sense is that in some ways the disciplines, not just women's studies, have kind of drifted away from the issue of power. And that's where we began. The women's studies was with the whole issue of power. And that, I don't want to overstate it, but I was just with a former graduate student of mine who teaches at a university in California, and she said she's having trouble trying to find a home for the work she's doing, which has to do with trafficking at a global level, that she goes to things that people seem to be involved with, kind of textual analysis and Gauss-Menace interaction kind of analysis of things, and that the issue of social power, which is what we were trying to democratize, however much we floundered and failed. We were trying to do that, and it seems like it's marginalized. I mean, that's kind of a question for those of you who know. It seems like it's a marginalized issue, which is pretty distressing to early founders.
It was definitely a period of, I would almost say, hyper-democracy, with some teachers letting their students give themselves their own grades. And I remember I was a student at the period when the women's studies was forming, and not women's studies, but the classes. And I can remember being in a meeting where we were choosing the coordinating committee, and everybody who was interested put their name in a hat. And that's how we chose them, by pulling them out. Which, isn't necessarily a bad way. I just don't know that that would happen today. But
I stopped letting students grade themselves because I thought, surprisingly, they would undergrade. And so I would,
they were.
and I was a hard grader, I would have to raise grades. What's going on?
Were they women? I guess we do have a low self-esteem.
Well, I was probably doing this in women's studies classes.
There's one point that I didn't have time to make that I would like to mention, and that is that I talked about the notion of fluidity and the fact that we were able to do what we did because the university was flexible enough to allow us to do that. And there was also this fluidity between community and university. It was some of the same people who were working in the community were in the university, and as people went through women's studies classes, and as they gained knowledge and confidence and began to be able to analyze their situations and the situations of other women, they began to form institutions in the community. It was people from women's studies who established the Rape Relief Hotline, which is now the Portland Women's Crisis Line, who helped to establish Bradley Angle House for victims of domestic violence. And I could go on, but this is an instance, it seems to me, of this wonderful fluidity between the community and the university that women's studies fostered.
I have a question for JoAnn. You said you spoke with people today, and some of them felt that the department had been damaged. I wasn't quite sure what you meant there. Their relationship with the department, or the department itself had somehow suffered? It wasn't true of my situation at all, but I was curious.
I'm so glad to hear that, and you can tell we didn't talk to each other before we came.
Well, not about that. We did talk
About that, yes,
Yeah.
we spoke.
Yeah.
This was, I think what she was talking about was the relationship between the women who were part of the case and the male colleagues and department heads in the particular department.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't general. It wasn't general. I only spoke with a few people, and this one was the one that was most memorable to me.
Well, English department people are pretty liberal, and they certainly, Nancy Porter and Chris Thompson would be very quick to see if I were teaching a course on George Eliot, who's a female novelist, if somebody doesn't know that she wrote under that name, and that would be double listed right away in women's studies and the English department. So, and the men are more liberal, I think, in English departments. Could you say what department it was? I'm wondering if it was a science or business or
Sociology.
Sociology, you would think would
Not
be.
here.
a
It
little
wasn't
better.
sociology.
Not here.
No, and I know,
Yeah.
still, wouldn't you expect better?
Well, I thought that is this going to be recorded?
Too late, it is, I think, already.
There are a lot of people in any department, including sociology, who might be very liberal, but then have personal hang-ups, can I put it that way? Personal problems dealing with women, didn't think women really belonged in the department, and so on and so forth. And so you could always get grief from those guys. But given the structure of the university, it was hard for them to get any control over the fact that I wanted to teach sociology of women, for example. But I also was in a different place because I was a plaintiff, and so were you. I was a witness, not a plaintiff. And I think it meant that my department chair never came to the court to testify what a horrible person I was. He could continue loving me. And I do think that maybe was one of the sources of the differences. Because, yeah, the people in sociology were all, liberals, Democrats, there were a couple socialists among them and so on and so forth, but they were guys, who wanted to continue male privilege for the most part. Okay?
I'm really glad to hear that it was not a universal experience and that for the most part people felt good. My friend also said that, with time and with the increase in women coming in and younger people coming in, the gaps began to disappear, and she feels that for a lot of reasons over time there have been remedies, including efforts at the legislature and affirmative action issues.
Ann told me today, Ann Hofstetter, of the letter I shared, she said, I think maybe we had our suit too early. It wasn't the time for it yet. And I didn't agree with her, because when is it too early? When do you step out? And in her letter, she said we lost the war. And talking to me today, she had it in reverse and agrees that the world is better. And we did make a difference.
Yeah.
And I don't think you should lose the symbolic value of the actual case. That certainly my memory of the case, and I knew only it as it being out there, but it had enormous symbolic value. And people said no, they had to think about it. The issue was raised in their mind. They had to identify the problem and think about it and come to some conclusion about it. So I think a lot of these things operate that way, as the actual decision is not as important as the event itself and the consequence of that event for the psyches, because we were talking about consciousness raising, and women started, wait, what is this? I don't need to put up with this anymore. Much like Nona's experience going to a meeting, hearing the testimony, hearing about the case for many young women was, I don't have to listen to this, I don't have to do this. It's not me, it's not my personal problem, it's a general problem.
That's a very good
Personal
point.
is political. Personal is political.
Yeah.
Had a lot of meaning.
Yeah.
And that's a really good point to hear you folks who were more broadly involved in it. For me, the case was the case, and that was my only exposure to it at all. So I love hearing the fact that there were things happening on different fronts, talking, small groups moving along, legislature, things like that. And that's really the way progress happens.
How many Philadelphia lawyers were there compared to you and Don?
Oh gosh, I think there were 4 or 5 that they hired a firm from Philadelphia, and then plus several AGs. They had 2 lawyers for each of the institutions. So there were plenty.
My husband always liked an uphill battle.
He did. He did.
So that's 20 lawyers?
It was
something
On their side. It's really shocking to hear $4.5 million when you think of the raises they could have given with that $4.5 million.
Yes, really.
Right. So I'm wondering if,
I just have a question about the context. What year was this?
Oh, good question. It was filed in 80, and the trial, then it takes, a long time to do discovery and all those things. The trial actually took place from 84 to 80, over the 84, 85.
Okay.
It was like probably September to June or something like that. And then the decision came out several months after that.
And you said your strategy was to use the Equal Pay Act. And why the Equal Pay Act versus?
In the first case where the 8 women won, they did the Equal Pay Act, and under the Equal Pay Act, you just showed the disparity in pay. You don't have to show intent. Why did we choose the other one? In the other case, we wanted to include promotion and tenure because we felt, if we're going to do it, we may as well clean it all up. And those were harder to prove. They just were harder to prove. I really felt that we would win on pay and lose on promotion and tenure, but they all got swept in. So, but we had, 3 victories, and then afterwards, some of the really compelling cases, we brought claims for individual people or groups, and they either settled right away, or we had smaller trials and they got resolved. So it wasn't all for naught.
So what act was the second one brought under? Was it the Equal Pay
It's
Act?
a Title VII. Title VII, and under Title VII.
Title VII of the Civil Rights?
Title VII, discrimination against women. Title VII is discrimination against everybody,
Yeah.
but women is one of them. That's right. Yes, civil rights, yes. And in that one, you have to show intent. And you can show intent by statistics, but if the other side gets up and starts refuting them, then yet there's a possibility that they won't be able to do that, and they did.
So this is the same act that women got equality, supposedly, in athletics?
That's Title IX,
Title
but it's the
IX,
same
but the
act.
same act,
It's
right, so
This was the one that was accidentally passed.
Yeah.
Women accidentally, I'm sorry, the act wasn't accidentally passed, but women were added to it accidentally.
Title VII.
In an attempt to kind of torpedo it. Otherwise, women wouldn't even have been in that.
Say a little more about that?
Well, I can't remember which smart senator from the South who didn't want equality, racial equality, thought that he would make this ridiculous. And so he added an amendment at the very last minute, adding women in. Am I right? That's
right.
That's right.
That's
Make
my
a joke
memory
of
of
it.
it.
That's right.
And
It's a joke.
but the result was that the whole thing got passed. But the important thing was we wouldn't have been in it except for his
The important thing is we ended up in it. I don't care how we got there.
Exactly, but the ridiculousness of thinking
It was. yes,
that
it
we
was.
were so what?
So absurd that
That's
the
so absurd that women
whole
would
thing would
want-
get thrown out. If we're gonna add blacks and everybody else, oh, let's just go all the way and add women.
Yeah, that's the way it was.
Wonderful.
Well, I want to thank you all. Does anybody have anything? We have a few more minutes, I'm sure. to
Well,
take
the
up.
only thing I'm interested in if other people in the audience have anything to add. I thought there was going to be more audience participation.
I think we have a lot of people who are some of you students now? Yeah.
As a social work student, I've had the privilege of having professors, all women, and being in classes with all women. But when I've entered the job market, I face this, what I call the addictive organization power structure. And sometimes it's a woman sitting at that desk, protecting or standing guard of that paradigm. And so what insight could you give a male black activist that my heroes are Dorothy Day and Jane Addams and Audre Lorde and Alex Walker? What would you tell me as far as continuing the collectivity of allowing that to come into my own career?
I pass. I mean, it's kind of like you're young, you're out there in the world, and you're going to work it out. And, I'm an old person from a different age cohort, different historical time. You're going to develop your own advice from your own experiences. It's the only thing I
I would say look for allies wherever you find them.
It's an,
Go there.
yes?
I'm not a panelist, but
Wait.
I'm not a panelist, but I'd just like to offer that you just keep doing what you're doing. You're voicing your consciousness about this issue, and that's very important. Someone said in curriculum we should have two things. We should have a window and a door. And every curriculum needs to have the window so we can see the world and see what they're doing, and we need to have that representation in the classroom. We also have to have a mirror, not a window, a mirror and a door. And the mirror is for us to be able to see our own experiences in the classroom as well. So for any kind of classroom you're in, if the professor's not providing a mirror and a window or a door, you need to question that. And I think you've certainly provided both of those things tonight, so thank you.
I wanted to say, since it's Don's birthday, he was a state senator for 10 years in Oregon, also representative for 2 years. He made Portland State University, and that was an uphill fight because University of Oregon and Oregon State weren't keen on the idea. He did a lot of things of that sort. He wrote the Scenic River Act. He did the first Marjorie pay in the nation, I've been told, pay for, and that was bipartisan. He was a Democrat, but in those days he said they worked better together. The first time they made rulings that migrant people had a right to a certain pay, migrant workers.
Any other comments? Okay. Well, thank you all very much.